This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 3 of season 4 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. Dr. Jeanson obtained his Bachelor of Science degree in molecular biology and bioinformatics from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, where he graduated summa cum laude. Dr. Jeanson also obtained his PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. Dr. Jeanson has been the recipient to several honors and awards, including an award from the National Science Foundation Research Experience for undergraduates in molecular biology and informatics. He's the author of several technical papers, having a paper published in Cell, The National, and Nature, which is considered one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. Dr. Jeanson has also put out 8 research presentations, including one at the National Conference on Undergraduate Research, University of Wisconsin, Whitewater, and is the author of 4 research abstracts, has written over 24 lay articles for ICR and AIG, and serves as a research biologist, author, and speaker with Answers in Genesis. Dr. Jeanson has contributed to several books and is the author of several of his own, including his latest book, Traced: Human DNA's Big Surprise. Dr. Jeanson in Traced used a combination of genetics, linguistics, and history to research Y chromosome data from people all over the globe, and what he found will be the subject of discussion for today's interview. Now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Jeanson. How was your day, and how are you doing?
Good, thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you on Current Topics in Science, Dr. Jeanson. And since this is Current Topics in Science, before we look at your new book, Traced, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. This morning's current topic comes from the site Big Think, which has an excerpt from the book Extreme North, A Cultural History by Brunner. Part of the excerpt says, "During the 19th century, the study of ancient cultures, at long last also including those of Northern and Western Europe, shook the foundations of belief in what had long been Christian dogma, that humanity, created by God, all at once in the biblical lands of the Near East, had existed for approximately 6,000 years. Archbishop James Ussher had come to this conclusion in 1650 based on an analysis of the Old Testament. According to his calculations, the world was created on a very specific date, October 23rd, 1404 BCE. Of course, the biblical story of the origin of humankind has long been contested by alternative theories. As long ago as the 1st century BCE, the Roman poet Lucretius recorded the supposition of his predecessor, the philosopher Epicurus, that our species, along with all the others, emerged as a result of random atomic mutations over a limitless expanse of time, and that humans must have evolved, only gradually and fitfully, from savagery to civilization, as Stephen Greenblatt writes in The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve." So, Dr. Jeanson, what do you think of this current topic? Do you think that the foundations of creationist belief have been shaken?
I've been told you answer a good speaker answers opinion questions with facts and factual questions with opinions. And so in this case, I think the facts are most relevant. We're now in a state of affairs where creation scientists are making major scientific discoveries. And if that's not the opposite of what he's claiming, I'm not sure what is. It's a new era in creation science. It's something I didn't anticipate. I guess I'm used to slow and gradual progress in scientific research, but this is really a remarkable time to be living and to be participating in creation science. And the exact opposite of what he's saying, I think, is the true state of affairs.
Well, thank you for addressing that current topic, Dr. Jeanson. Indeed, the foundations of biblical history stand firm. And while we're on the subject of history, let's get to your new book, Traced: Human DNA's Big Surprise. As I was reading through the book, I found it to be very fascinating and gripping right from the start. In the book's introduction, The Hiddenness of History, you raise several questions. Who did the ancient Sumerians come from? From whom did the Egyptians arise? What about the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Greeks, Romans? When these empires were overthrown, what happened to the people of these ancient civilizations? Did they just recede into the shadows of history? Did they go extinct? Are they still with us today? Dr. Jeanson, those are very important questions pertaining to the history of our world, and when we're looking at such massive subjects as these, what should we keep in mind as we're studying the history of humanity?
The first thing that comes to mind is to recognize that these have long been unanswered. The last history course I took was in high school, world history, US history, growing up in the United States. And really, world history for me was largely history of Western civilization. And despite its focus on the West, or even if it's narrowed to the West, the major questions left unanswered are exactly those. The question of the peoples. Most history is taught and has been taught as a history of politics, of cultures, of religions. I went to a Christian high school, so of course we talked about religious history, Protestant history, that sort of thing, Reformation and such, and how it influenced the state of affairs now in the United States. But the question of who various civilizations come from was something that nagged at me for a long time. So you can talk about the Egyptians, the date their first dynasty was founded, the date in which the Assyrians and Persians and Greeks eventually overthrew it, and the end with Cleopatra and such. You can talk about the founding of Rome, the date for the founding of Rome, the overthrow of the Western Roman Empire in the 400s AD, and the eventual conquest of the Eastern Roman Empire by the Ottomans in the 1400s. All that's fine and good, but it leaves unanswered the question of who the Egyptians came from, who the Romans came from, what happened to the Roman people after their civilization collapsed, what happened to the Egyptian people after their civilization collapsed. I've since learned the reason for the absence of these answers is because of our limitations in being able to acquire them. There's really only two ways to get them. Either you have comprehensive written records, where each generation, there's a comprehensive, detailed attempt to keep a record of who specifically each person came from. And we only have these in rare cases. Let's say the royalty in Great Britain and royalty elsewhere. But for the average person, good luck. I was just talking with one of my relatives in Germany today, trying to fill in our family tree and do so with genetic testing. And that's really the second way to arrive at the answer to this question of who these peoples came from. It's DNA. And the history of DNA is such that up until 1953, the scientific community still had no idea what was the physical basis for heredity. So it wasn't even possible to be a tool until about 70 years ago. And then fast forward, the human DNA sequence, the full DNA sequence, wasn't uncovered until about 2 decades ago, 2001. And then what is the focus of my book, the Y chromosome, which is for technical reasons that are lengthy to get into. That's one of the best tools we have to go deep into history. That data set, that body of data, getting the Y chromosome sequences, and by the way, the Y chromosome being the male inherited DNA from father to son, and so on. That data set has only come to our possession in the last 5 to 10 years. So the reason these questions have been unanswered and unaddressed in history class for so long is we've lacked the tools to do so. And now finally we have the tools to be able to do this. And so the answers can finally be uncovered, and we can finally tell the rest of the story of the history of mankind.
If you don't mind me going off script a little bit, like when you were looking at all of these like different cultures and things, like was there something that stood out to you that you learned like, wow, that's actually really interesting the way they did that? Or
the backstory to uncovering these answers, I think, is quite interesting from multiple perspectives. One being here in the United States. Secondly, growing up, learning US history with very little taught about the pre-Columbian history of the Americas, the history of the Americas before Europeans arrived. We learned about who the Europeans encountered as they moved westward, and all sorts of details on their ways of life, from the Iroquois and the Delaware and the Navajo and the Choctaw, Chickasaw, you name it. But there was never any story, any history for these peoples, who they came from or what they were doing for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. So that's the second reason. There's irony in what I'm about to tell you. One of the rules I learned in graduate school when doing any research project is you start with what you know, you beat that subject to death until it yields all of its secrets, and then you can move on to the unknown. So one of the things I was doing a couple of years ago as I was looking through the Y chromosome data was starting with the known. And let me actually add one more backstory element to this as well. This whole project got started probably around 2015. I mean, you can take it back even further. 2009 is when I started with the Institute for Creation Research. And what I was tasked with at that point was coming up with a biology research program. The CEO then was Henry Morris III, and he had said that the creation community had done a lot of geology research, astronomy research, and what was really needed to take it the next step, given the avalanche of data that was appearing, was a biology research program. And so that's what I began, identifying the questions that needed to be answered and the tools to do it. And of course, genetics being the key tool. The questions naturally being that all revolving around the origin of species. So there was a broader focus early on, but one of the best studied species at the genetic level is our own. Bacteria probably have the most genetic data simply because their DNA is much shorter, smaller than ours, so it's easier to get, much more cost effective. But research money, for understandable reasons, is in the human realm. And of course, a lot of that funding comes from the National Institutes for Health, because we're trying to find cures for disease. And the relevance of genetics to that, of course, is becoming greater as time passes. So now we have the question of the origin of species. We've got a lot of data in humans. And so we began to uncover some initial results for the question of human origins. And I worked a lot with the female inherited DNA at that time, mitochondrial DNA. Again, it's a much shorter piece of DNA. It's only about 16,000, 17,000 letters long. The Y chromosome is about, well, it's 60 million, but the usable region is about 10 million. Anyway, so I was working with mitochondrial DNA. We had seen some genetic echoes of Noah and the flood. And at that point now, so now we're back up to 2015, my thought was, where do you go next with this research? And if we've got the echo of creation, we had some genetic clocks, some evidence pointing towards the existence of and the origin of humankind about 6,000 years ago. Then an echo of the flood with Noah's sons' wives. Well, what's next in the biblical narrative? Creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, to use the C's of creation as we use it in Answers in Genesis. Confusion is the Tower of Babel. So at that point, I initiated a research collaboration with a linguist, a retired guy from the Wycliffe Bible Translators, a PhD, who was going to work with me, and we're going to try to overlay the genetic and the linguistic maps of humanity. My thinking was Genesis 11 is primarily a linguistic event. God sends people outward by confusing their languages. That linguistic event is going to have some very clear genetic signatures. So why not see how these two overlap? Now, looking back, it's easy to see and easy to predict how that research would have turned out. You can change your language. You can't change your DNA. So there's obviously some major points of divergence. One of the best examples being African Americans. They do not speak African languages today. They speak Indo-European ones, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and such in the Americas. But genetically, they're unambiguously African in origin. There were some places, though, such as New Guinea, other places that have been largely isolated from conquest and such throughout human history, where there was genetic overlap and linguistic overlap. There was genetic isolation, linguistic isolation, and all that, to make a long story short, led us to the conclusion that it is basically a mistake to go looking for Babel first. Yes, you can go looking for genetic echoes of the flood, because there's a hard stop, a hard cutoff between pre-flood and post-flood. But post-flood, biblically even, human history doesn't end with confusion. You look at the history of Israel, and they have, even before Christ, centuries of conquest intermixing with foreign peoples. They come out of Egypt with a mixed multitude. The northern tribes are conquered by Assyria. The southern tribes are conquered by Babylon, and eventually by Persia. Some are resettled back in Israel. Some escape to Egypt. And this is centuries before Christ, which, of course, then you've got 2,000 years thereafter of conquest, intermingling, migration. And keep in mind, this is all with a people who are commanded for religious reasons to basically stay together. How much more so would conquest and migration, rape, pillage, slaughter, all that apply to the other peoples of the globe who spread out from Babel, who had no such religious reasons to stay together? So, long story short, again, with the result of all that was to invert our project. Instead of looking for the echo of Babel, we said, well, let's start looking for the genetic echo of events in the recent past and then work our way backwards in time. So I actually worked with Rob Carter for a while of Creation Ministries International. We were collaborating. He was working with the Y chromosome then initially. I was working with the mitochondrial DNA, so the female inheritance, the male inheritance. I was doing the female side with mitochondrial, him the male inheritance with Y chromosome, and we looked for the genetic echo of the transatlantic slave trade. So can we date genealogically the separation between African-American lineages and African lineages? Part of the reason for that was because the data was publicly available. And again, to summarize a lot of research over several years, we published, we gave a presentation at the Creation Research Society meeting a year or two, and that eventually spawned the question of what's the history of the whole globe. So that's how we got to this point in terms of trying to understand human history. There's the backstory to how we got here and how the research to traced came over time. It's basically following the evidence where it led. It started with the origin of species. We happen to have a lot of data for humans, so there was a heavy focus then on the origin of the human species, and then of course that led to the question of human history. And that's now long story short, the result of that is this book Traced, which tries to look for the rest of the story. The key step in recognizing that this DNA-based family tree is in fact a reliable tool to uncover the story of peoples, and that it's a tool that's very closely aligned with the biblical timescale, going back to Noah 4,500 years ago, and with the biblical anthropology, the history we see in the Old and New Testaments. All that came back to the Native Americans. So again, you start with what you know, and you beat that to death until it yields its secret. So I've given a long backstory. Here's how we got to the key insight that led to, yes, this is really working, and now we can unravel the story of the whole world. When I moved to Kentucky in 2015, I'm in a small town, Burlington. It has a great library. There's only about 20,000 people here. And one of the books in the history section was this book called 1491, written by Charles Mann, who's a writer for Science magazine. So he's not a creationist by any stretch of the imagination, but a great science writer. And a lot of what he says, you can translate to a young Earth timescale, or he's just writing about things that are not controversial between creation and evolution. One of the big things he pointed out came from his own backstory. So he said he had took history, I think, taken history maybe in the 70s, and the stereotype back then, and still often that persists to this day, is that the Native Americans were small in number. They were barely interacting with their environment, sort of this tree hugger, for lack of a better term, approach to things. There's the Europeans who came in and destroyed that whole way of life. And he had been attending archaeological meetings and such. I mean, that's what you do as a science writer for whatever topic he's interested in, and had been learning about the massive revolution that was occurring in the pre-Columbian archaeology of the Americas. And he said what was sad for him was to see his son take history and learn some of the same stereotypes that he had been taught, the wrong stereotypes about the pre-Columbian Americas that he had been taught decades prior. So he said, well, someone should really write a book about the changes that are taking place, which then fell to him. And the disclaimer he gives at the beginning of his book is, he says, the archaeological discoveries and revolutions are happening at such a breakneck pace, it's basically impossible to write a history of the pre-Columbian Americas, because by the time you finish the book, you'll have to change the beginning. It changes that fast. So he says, I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to give you sort of pick 3 topics and give you the state of affairs where they're at. One of the state of affairs was related to the population sizes, and current estimates for the pre-Columbian population sizes were close to the total population size of Europe at that time, 50 to 60 million people. There's still a lot of controversy. Numbers are all over the map, but there was a huge number here, and that number dropped dramatically with the arrival of Europeans due to a variety of factors, disease, enslavement, so forth, to maybe 10% of the original number. So an 80 to 90% population collapse. All that backstory is relevant because I have that in my head then. I've read this book. I know there's been a massive population collapse in the Americas. I'm looking at this Y chromosome data, this genetics-based, DNA-based, male inheritance-based tree of humanity, and asking, what are the things we should look for? We know there was a massive population collapse. What is the genetic echo of this? And it's somewhat technical to get into. The short answer is you're looking for flat lines in the family tree. We're looking at DNA from survivors, and anyway, that's a lengthier discussion, but look for it. Where is the echo of the population collapse in the Americas in the family tree? Finally found it. That was the aha moment. So here, having grown up in the United States, having grown up learning next to nothing about the pre-Columbian history of the Americas, then suddenly discovering about this revolution, and then finding the echo of this in our DNA, this being the linchpin, and saying, okay, this is working. Now we can go unravel the rest of the history. And so that's been a process over the past 2 or 3 years, sort of, for me personally, having to backfill a lot of history I never learned, in particular Eastern history, South Asia, India and such, East Asia, the Pacific, and of course, obviously the pre-Columbian Americas, to try to find the echoes of all this history then in our DNA. And it's been wildly successful in ways I never could have imagined. and extremely exciting because it's really the beginning of a project that will likely take the rest of my life. We're just at a stage of having DNA, good quality DNA from maybe 50,000 men. Again, this is male inherited DNA. That's why we're looking at just the men who have it. And we've been able to connect a lot of dots historically, but there's a ton of questions left to be answered, a ton of stories left to be unraveled for every people group on Earth. In theory, that's really the next stage. In theory, now we can uncover the history of every people group on Earth. And that's what I'm pursuing at the moment.
Dr. Jeanson, that is incredible. And I have to say, I admire the lifelong, diligent commitment to your work. That's just amazing. And actually, speaking of your work, I really loved the uniqueness of the book Traced. So, for example, your other book, Replacing Darwin, New Origin of Species, was also a very unique book. That's something that I've found to be sort of a calling card of your work. It's interesting and unique. So you were looking at Darwin's ideas using modern science and seeing if his conclusions be the same. In this book, Traced, you said, by training, I'm a biologist. And so, Dr. Jeanson, as a biologist, and you graduated from an Ivy League school, you're looking at history from a different perspective than most other people who've tackled the same question. So can you tell us, what is it exactly that sets Traced apart from all other books tackling the history of humanity?
There's several things that come to mind immediately, and I'll save the creation evolution relevance for the end, why this is such a big bombshell. But I'll begin by referencing a quote that we've got at the top of the book once it comes out, and you can see it in the ebook as well, I think, which is currently available for immediate download, purchase and download. Ken Ham is quoted as saying this is the new Rosetta Stone of human history, something like that, using the term Rosetta Stone. And of course, the physical Rosetta Stone was discovered at the end of the 1700s. I think it was by a Frenchman in Egypt. And it was revolutionary because at that time, the world was aware of the Egyptian hieroglyphic script. So the written record from the Egyptians themselves about who they were, what they did, and what happened to them during their civilization. And we had no access to it. So here was this massive window into the past, into a tantalizingly glorious past. I mean, glitter and gold and such. It's who isn't entranced by ancient Egypt? And here we had but the window was dark. No one could read this history. And the Rosetta Stone had Egyptian hieroglyphics. It had a form of ancient Egyptian cursive, demotic, not demonic, but demotic, and then Greek. So the world could read Greek. And they were able then to compare the Greek, which was the translation of the hieroglyphics, to elucidate this. And so this has massive implications for understanding of the ancient past. All that to say, I don't think the endorsement is an overstatement. It's a pretty bold statement, but what we have now at our possession, this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity, is a massive new insight into ancient history, recent history. It's a whole new way of understanding the history of mankind. So just to tick off a few of the reasons why I think this is such a big deal and will be a big deal for years to come. So number one, it answers the questions of history that we've long wondered about. Who did these ancient civilizations come from? Who do more recent civilizations come from? And what happens to the people of these civilizations when their political empires, entities, collapse or are eventually overrun by conquerors? So that's number one. It answers long-standing questions of history that we've long lacked the answers to. Secondly, it gives us dramatic new insights into what I'm going to call prehistory. So from a biblical perspective, we have history from the beginning, written records from the beginning. When I say prehistory, I'm saying after mankind restarts at the flood, you've got Noah and the 8 people, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. After they restart, they begin to multiply again. Genesis 10 lists some of the offspring, the male offspring of these families. And then, of course, Genesis 11 says God separates these families at Babel because they disobey him. Instead of spreading out, they want to build a tower to heaven, and God disapproves, so he separates them according to their language. Some of those people who spread out either no longer write down what they're doing, or the records have been lost, or in some cases, and you can look at examples of this from probably multiple places around the globe. What comes to mind immediately is the Chinese early on in the BC era. They'll destroy records. So that's what I'm talking about, prehistory. In terms of the pre-Columbian Americas, often classified as prehistory, because yes, we have some Mayan carvings. Some of the kings would carve and write their records. But for the most part, it's been a big black box because either it's oral history, and what do you do with that? or there is no written history, or the written records were lost. I think the Aztecs may have even destroyed some of the records as well, the peoples who came before them. Seems to be a general pattern in history, which understandable from a political perspective if you're trying to dominate, but leaves us in a sad state of affairs today, trying to unravel what really happened. So this new Rosetta Stone, this new discovery, I'm saying, second reason this is such a big deal is because we now have new insights. So specifically, as an example, on the question of the pre-Columbian Americas, we now know that the Americas were settled probably at least 3 times, maybe 4, before Europeans arrived. So the mainstream view, of course, is that, and this is based on archaeology and then overlaying genetics on their long timescale historical archaeological record. They would say that the first Americans arrived 15,000 years ago, and that was it. And they've just been sitting here in isolation, no contact with the old world for 14,500 years until Columbus arrives. So this is a dramatic rewriting of that account. There was a settling and arrival from Central Asia in the Americas about 1000 AD, and then going backwards in time, probably about 300 to 600 AD. Both of these settlings post-date 2 major civilizations, the beginning of the Mayan civilization and the beginning of the Olmecs. The Olmecs were a cradle of civilization. We do not yet have, we haven't yet discovered the genetic lineage of the Mayans and the Olmecs. It could have gone extinct, who knows? But my point is, we've got evidence for 2 settlings and those post-date known other civilizations. So there must have been the settling of the Mayans, perhaps also the Olmecs if they were separate. So this is a very different picture of what the mainstream community has advocated and concluded. And it makes the pre-Columbian Americas a very dynamic place. And we can actually connect some of these settling events to old world events. So it anchors pre-Columbian American history in known, accepted old world history. Just as one example, the settling of the 300s, 600s is right around the same time there was a major upheaval in Central Asia. It's called the Völkerwanderung, or the Great Wandering of Peoples. When it's the time the Huns come in and overthrow the Roman Empire. It's the time when some of the other Central Asian peoples come and overthrow the great Han Chinese Empire. And so, lo and behold, there's also a group that migrates out and comes to the Americas and may have played a role in the downfall of the Mayan Empire as well, which is sort of the classic American equivalent of the Roman Empire. So anyway, I'll make it faster here because that's only 2 reasons, and I've got more. There's biblical history now we see in this tree. You've got Noah, his 3 sons. I can tell someone if they take a Y chromosome test exactly which son of Noah they go back to, and maybe even some of the specific men in Genesis 10. We can see the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in this tree, and some of the 1 or 2 of the tribes of Israel, with some more probably left to be discovered. We can, like I'll make this a separate point though. We can again connect every person's ancestry. There's answers of personal ancestry for each family. We can connect each family line again back to specific ancestors in Genesis 10. There's relevance to indigenous histories. I've got about 6 examples, several in the book, of oral histories that either were dismissed or ignored by mainstream science that the Y chromosome appears to confirm. There's a long written account of the Delaware Indians indicating a arrival from Central Asia, and there being people here already. The Pashtuns of Afghanistan claim descent from a supposed grandson of King Saul of Israel, Afghana, hence the name Afghanistan, which even Encyclopedia Britannica talks about this. Well, there's evidence genetically for that possibly being true as well. And on the list goes, which then I think raises again another application. Another reason this is a big deal is missions. So you're going into a new culture, perhaps there's no biblical background whatsoever, or maybe there is some sort of indigenous history. What do you do with it? What sort of apologetics do you do as you're translating the Bible into this indigenous group's language, and they have their own accounts? Well, this is another tool to do that. On 2 fronts, you can connect with their DNA, their histories back to Genesis 10 and say, this is where your story starts right here from this man. And also there may be some echoes of that history in their own accounts and histories that we could likely uncover and further elucidate with this Y chromosome tree. Other reasons this is such a big deal, I would say the research in trace is one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. So there's a strong young earth apologetic here. And lastly, the reason this is such a big deal relates to the relationship between this book, Traced, and then the other book, Replacing Darwin. So the title Replacing Darwin is specifically chosen, not Rebutting Darwin, because one of the main arguments against creation science from the evolutionary community, one of the main demands of creation science from the evolutionary community, is that the creationists not just criticize evolution. They say that's not enough. Now, there's good arguments against evolution. This is not me saying what my personal opinion is. This is simply, I'm relaying what the evolutionary community has demanded and said, here's what needs to happen before creation science can be considered science and not just a religious idea. They have said creationists need to make testable predictions. So they would say, okay, you creationists believe God created kinds of creatures 6,000 years ago. And Noah took two of every kind on board the ark. How does that make any predictions whatsoever? For example, how many new species will form this year? Predict that for us, creationists. Or they'll say, let's go out into the wild and measure the rate at which the DNA of a grasshopper species changes, or something else in which it's not been measured. Predict for us the rate at which it will occur before we actually measure it. That's what they're looking for. I put specific testable predictions in print in Replacing Darwin, one of them being that if the young Earth model is true, we should be able to read off of our DNA the history of civilization. History of civilization is basically post-flood history, and it should be boom, 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 read it all off. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in the 1200s, you should see East Asian DNA coming into Europe at that point. That's just one example. And on the examples could go from history. And that's basically one long answer to it in trace. That's what we see. It's a fulfilled prediction. Plus, as I alluded to earlier, there's this whole research program that emerges from it that may take the rest of my life. We can now uncover the history of every people group on Earth, connect them back to ancestors in Genesis 10. The Genesis 10 framework gives me a where to look, how deep to look, predictions framework, and where these branches will ultimately come from and connect to. There's a whole program here that fulfills in spades what the evolutionists have demanded for decades. And so this really puts the creationists on offense. Or to put it perhaps in Answers in Genesis terms, we talk a lot about defending biblical authority. I like to say this book, Traced, doesn't defend biblical authority because it doesn't play defense. It puts biblical authority on offense because it's now meeting these standards that evolutionists have demanded and exceeding them. And we're just making new discoveries about the world. It's moving forward with science. It becomes virtually undeniable, I guess you could say, that creation science is science. It's advancing our knowledge about the world. That's what makes it, to me, the biggest deal of all in the context of the creation evolution debate.
That is really incredible, Dr. Jeanson. And so actually, if you don't mind me going off script again, I just wanted to ask, this new project sounds incredible. So if people say want to get involved in this somehow or contribute in some way, like how would you see this sort of panning out or happening?
Absolutely. And I was hoping you'd ask that. I hadn't planned on it per se, but that's really the next phase. And it's human history. So you, the listener, can participate. And I'll mention this website hopefully several times. It's a website associated with the book, but also a place for taking the project further. I'm calling this next phase of the research sort of the book has laid the groundwork, and now where do we go from here? I'm calling that the where do we go from here part, the hidden history of every people group project. And you can find a link and a contact form if you go to the following web address. So it's answersingenesis.org. You basically go to our homepage, Answers in Genesis homepage, answersingenesis.org, and it's /go/traced. So the name of the book, Answers in Genesis /go/trace. And there you will find that there'll be supplemental information related to the book, but there'll be a button you can just push on that says Hidden History of Every People Project. And that'll take you down to a contact form. You put in your information, your email, and whatever comment you want. So the ways that listeners can help, there's a couple of ways you can do it. It may be that someone has taken a DNA test and either they want help interpreting it. That's one scenario in which there may be some contributions to research going forward. I did put a table in the book, Traced, where it goes through the major branches of the family tree and say, okay, if your Y chromosome result is this is who you came from. Now, what may happen, and this will happen, it's already happened. Someone had emailed me several months ago saying, hey, I took a test, and I should add a backstory here momentarily. The preliminary research to this book, we announced and described in a 25-part video series I did with Ken Ham. We call that The New History of the Human Race. You can find that on our streaming service, answers.tv, or on our Answers in Genesis YouTube channel. And one guy had taken a Y chromosome test, has messaged me saying, well, you didn't cover this branch. And there was a reason for that because I didn't quite yet know the answer to it. And there was even some ambiguity. He had taken 2 different tests and gotten 2 different answers. Those types of things will happen, rarely, because just for reasons I don't have time to get into. And those rare instances will be especially interesting for research going forward. It may be one of these lineages to a people group we haven't yet told the story of. For example, the ancient Assyrians have yet to be identified in the current Y chromosome-based, DNA-based family tree for global humanity. Now, I think the reason for that is they were conquered, never to rise again as a political entity, over 2,500 years ago. It's basically Iranian or Arab peoples who've ruled the Middle East for the last 2,500 years. And so it's not surprising to me that we don't yet find an Assyrian lineage. And by the way, the Bible connects Assyria back to Asher, son of Shem. If you see that word in English Bibles translated Assyria, let's say in Kings, King Hezekiah, and Sennacherib, king of, it's literally in Hebrew, king of Asher. And we translated Assyria, Bible translators do. So I can tell you, I can predict for you exactly where on the tree that lineage should branch off and how we could be able to positively identify an Assyrian branch. Well, we don't yet see it in the tree. There may be someone out there who still has it. That lineage may have survived. They may have just been incorporated into the ancient Babylonian kingdoms and then the Persian kingdoms and so on. So that's one way that someone might be able to contribute to the research is they've taken a test, they need some help with it, or, hey, this seems weird or rare. Well, that may be the best candidate for identifying one of these groups going forward. Another way someone might participate would be, let's say they belong to a people group, an indigenous group, let's say, whose DNA has yet to be tested. Hey, I want to volunteer, or maybe I didn't cover it in the book explicitly. That would be another tremendous path forward. And what tends to be the rule so far, and what I've seen, is some of the rare indigenous groups have some of the most interesting history. Right now, I'm working with a guy who's originally from South India. And this is actually a little bit different from what I put in the book because, I say in the book that some of these answers are likely wrong because research advances as we go. In the book, I say that we have the lineage of one of the cradles of Indian civilization, the Indus River Valley. I've since received some evidence suggesting that we don't yet have it, it's still missing. And some of the rare forest peoples in India may actually belong to one of these lineages, and we're working on trying to understand this question right now. So my point being, if you're a member, you're watching this and you're a member of an indigenous people group, perhaps someone who has yet to have their DNA tested, you may have some of the most interesting answers to history yet. Third category, I'd say, I'm speaking in and painting with very broad brushstrokes. Let's say you're a missionary working with an obscure people group or in some indigenous group that has yet to be studied. There's another way forward to answer these questions. So all that to say, indigenous, international, rare, there's lots of ways to advance this research forward. The basic principle behind everything I've just said here is the deeper we dig, in other words, the more people whose DNA we sample, the more answers will eventually emerge. The way to make the best sense of these answers is if we have, okay, what is the indigenous history of a particular people group? What is the DNA results of this particular people group? What is the archaeological evidence? All this together helps form a cohesive narrative and are all clues to this larger puzzle to say, okay, this is what this DNA sequence represents. This is the history that it represents. Here's these new insights we can gain. So thinking again of Indian history, as in India, the Asian country, the period from the Indus River Valley civilization up till about the time of Buddha, which I think is about 600 BC, is covered by some of the Hindu scripts and writings that historians bang their head against the wall trying to figure out, what do you do with it? Is there history here? Is this exaggerated religious writing? There's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and genetics now is this great new tool by which we might be able to answer them. So again, Answers in Genesis /go/traced, and there's a button you can click, the hidden history of every people, enter your form. It's a great way to start a dialogue. I've been surprised myself at the unprompted international interest that I've already received from this. So there's a Muslim guy in Chad who emailed me wanting to find out relationship, his own history, and perhaps the relationship to Ishmael. There's a guy in Saudi Arabia who contacted me, another Muslim. Again, there's a South Indian. I had a lady connected to the Karen people of Burma and Thailand, another one from the Hmong people in South China and Southeast Asia. So I've been very encouraged by these initial results. And my hope is that as more people participate and gain interest, and we put our heads together, we will be able to eventually uncover the history of every people group then on Earth and the comprehensive history of the globe.
And thank you so much thank you for sharing that awesome perspective with us, Dr. Jeanson. I know for one, I appreciated Traced, and I'm sure other readers will as well. And by the way, before we take a look at some of the hidden surprises in Traced, I think it would be good to explain to readers how you came to some of the conclusions that you did. So once again, to quote from the introduction of Traced, you write, "Of the billions of people who roam our planet, we have public access to the DNA from only thousands of them. The conclusions you will find in this book are based on these sequences. These conclusions will likely be updated and may change." You already mentioned this, and may change as more data comes in. Some readers might find that last sentence unsettling. It's actually a distinguishing feature of science. By definition, scientific ideas must be open to change and even direct disproof. Uncertainty, rather than certainty, is the rule in science. Dr. Jeanson, can you explain to us what exactly are, you were just talking about this, what exactly are these DNA sequences? How did you use them in your research? How does this field of science intersect with the field of history? Like, do you recommend a specific DNA test? Can you explain all that for us?
Yes, and the field of genetics can get complex quickly, but really this whole study boils down to two very simple principles. They're not necessarily well-known principles, but they're basic ones, and together it's a very straightforward conclusion. One thing that probably is more recognizable is DNA is the substance of heredity. Again, this has been known in the scientific community since the 50s, and anyone who's taken a high school biology course has probably heard about this in some way. DNA is the substance of heredity. So that's the first principle. DNA is the record of inheritance. So your eye color, your hair color, your height, and all that, which you inherit that information from your parents, that's encoded by your DNA. So DNA number one tells you who you came from, and then encodes these features, which again are also indicators of who you came from. The second thing that is less well known, but is a critical aspect of this, is that DNA also marks the passage of time. So when dad passes on DNA, when mom passes on DNA, and in cell biology terms, it's through sperm and egg. And when the sperm cell is produced and the DNA is copied and put in the sperm cell, DNA is copied and put in the egg cell, that process is imperfect, which for Christians, we live in a fallen world, no surprises there. Things are less optimal than they once were. This is not the perfect creation that God designed in the beginning. He cursed it. So we have things like this that arise. And one of the results of this copying process that's in error is diseases. You can think about cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. You can trace it to very specific DNA changes and say, this is why this person has this disease. It's sad, but now we have the ability to uncover cause-effect relationships. The point as it relates to history is DNA marks the passage of time because these mutations, these changes, these mistakes add up over time. So you can compare my DNA to my dad's, and let's say there's, if you're talking Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, 3 differences. And you compare my dad's DNA to his dad, and there's 3 more differences. So if you compare my DNA to my grandfather's DNA, 6 differences. And so you can compare Y chromosome sequences and count the number of differences. That's a marker of time, marker of the passage of time, to say how many generations ago did we have a common ancestor? Was it recent? Was it distant? That sort of thing. So those 2 principles, DNA marks inheritance, who you come from. DNA marks the passage of time. Well, inheritance plus time, that's exactly what family trees record, who you came from and when. And so that's how DNA acts like a marker and actually directly tells us who we came from and tells us this family tree. So really, again, the main point of the book, the new Rosetta Stone of human history, is this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity. And it's based on these principles. DNA marks who you came from, it marks the passage of time, and together those give us and uncover for us a family tree for the globe. In terms of where people should go to get a genetic test, and perhaps related to this is, what if you're a lady? How do you find out your history? And it's really not a question that's unique to women, because even me as a male, I get my Y chromosome tested. It tells me my paternal inheritance. It doesn't tell me anything about my mother's side. So, and I was actually just on a phone call with my mother's brother, a Zoom call with him, because we had him get his Y chromosome tested. That's the way to figure out the female side of the equation, and really the other half for the male. Because again, my Y chromosome test is just one small slice of the many branches on my family tree. So in terms of specifics then, the way to uncover the deeper history, to connect back to specific sons of Noah, will be a Y chromosome test. And different companies offer different prices for different levels of detail. Usually just a basic test, a basic Y chromosome test, the cheapest Y chromosome test will suffice to figure out what major branch you belong to. If you're really interested in the details and exactly when you branched off, at which point and from whom, then you can pay the several $100s for a more expensive one. In general, not all companies, genetic testing companies, offer Y chromosome tests. I don't think Ancestry.com, which is one of the more popular ones out there, offers a Y chromosome test, or it's even part of the basic package. There are others that have Y chromosome tests built into the basic package. I think 23andMe does this. We had friends stay at our house where I think either they or a relative of theirs had done the 23andMe. And I said, well, did they do a Y chromosome test? I don't know. So they looked up the results. Lo and behold, there it was. And we could figure out their family history, their genealogical connection. I have used family tree DNA just because you can pay for a specific Y chromosome test. That's not necessarily endorsing all that. It's just, this is what's out there. My recommendation is find someone, see if they offer a specific Y chromosome test, and then email customer service just to confirm. Because prices change, tests change, technology changes. I mean, you watch this recording 5 months from now, who knows what the situation will be. So just find a company, make sure they offer on their website, or if you call them, are you offering a Y chromosome test? Make sure it'll give you the answer, paternal inheritance, the specific branch you belong to, and that should give you what you need to know. And then in combination with the table in the book, or let's say, you go to the website or ancestrygenesis.org/go/trace, and you enter your information there. That's another way to get help with that as well, because the reporting for some of these companies isn't always consistent, or they might report a marker instead of a branch that uses terminology that the book uses. I tried to use pretty standard terminology, but again, companies are not bound to use that. So that's what I'd recommend in terms of trying to find out the deeper history, so that, number one, Y chromosome test. Number two, as many independent male lineages as you can. So think of it, let's say, in terms of grandparents. I get my Y chromosome tested. That's my father's line. Doesn't tell me my father's mother's line. So if we can find a brother there or a great uncle or something, that would work. Then we get the mother's side, my mother's side. We've got her father's line by getting the father's son, uncle, tested. We'd also like to get the mother's brother, or some sort of male relative on that side. So then you've got the 4 grandparental lineages. And again, there's more information there. You can knock yourself out testing all sorts of relatives. Just make sure they're independent male lines. And I do this whenever I'm talking with people. I do it for myself. Draw out your family tree and just see if there's an unbroken male inheritance line. And that's how you identify the various branches you need to test. And of course, then you need to have relationships with these people to see if they're willing to do it. Or in some cases, so my wife's side, we've done this for several of those branches. My father-in-law's mother's side has a whole Facebook page dedicated to that family name. We didn't have to do any testing. The answer was already there. So you might be surprised at what you find just when you go looking for it.
Dr. Jeanson, thank you so much for covering all that groundwork for us. It certainly helps contextualize your research. In the 4th chapter of your book, you ask the question, have the ethnicities of antiquity been preserved in modern peoples who roam the geographic realms of the ancients? So, Dr. Jeanson, that is a very profound question, and in your book you have several sections dedicated to various histories, starting with Africa, then moving to Europe and Central Asia, the Middle East, South Asia, the Far East, the Pacific, and finally, the Americas. So, Dr. Jeanson, what are some things that you found out about all of these ancients, and what does that tell us about humanity? Are we really separate people groups? Are we one large family? And as you said, are we more connected than we think?
Let's use ancient Egypt as an example. The structure of the book revolves around 7 plus 1, 8 civilizations, to see if we can uncover the origin and fate of these various peoples. And I say, in trying to answer the question for these 7 civilizations or cultures, we end up uncovering the story of the whole world, which is true in one sense and true and not in another sense, which you'll have to read the book to find out. But for Egypt, let's frame the question, and then I'll talk about the answer momentarily. You think about the history of Egypt, the stuff that gets all the attention, King Tut and the Great Pyramids of Giza and all that, the Valley of the Kings. All that history is the history of an African civilization. You think of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, African language. You think of the Egyptian religion, the various gods they worship, that's African. And I emphasize African because after the Assyrians and Persians, Greeks, Romans invaded, Egypt was ruled by non-Africans for the next 2 millennia, whether it's Europeans, again, Romans or Greeks and such, or Asians. So you've got Muhammad, of course, conquering and displacing the Romans. You've got Ottoman Turks, which are Asian. It's just one foreign ruler after another. And so it's worth asking the question, should there be an ancient Egyptian lineage, an African lineage that survives to this day? Now, scripture tells us who these Egyptians came from. Misraim, one of the sons of Ham, listed in Genesis 10. And we know that because that word Misraim is the actual Hebrew word that many English Bibles translate as Egypt. When the Israelites go down into Egypt, it's the land of Misraim, the land of Ham they talk about. So should we even go look at, should we expect to find the lineage of Misraim surviving to this day? What I show in the book is there, first of all, the majority, or I should say, not even the majority, the plurality of modern Egyptians go back to and belong to a branch. About 40% of modern Egyptian men belong to a branch whose geographic distribution and specific branching history, looking at when these separate on the family tree, matches a lot of the Arab Islamic history. So the Arabs, of course, came out of the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad and his followers conquering beginning in the 600s AD, and have an empire that lasts, depending on where you look, into maybe the 900s, covers North Africa, including Egypt, the Middle East, pushes up into Central Asia, rules in Spain for several centuries. The Egyptian men, the plurality of Egyptian men, 40% of them belong to this lineage. I say plurality because Egyptians, modern Egyptians, like pretty much every other people group on earth, have a great diversity of branches to which they belong. Human history is messy. So that initial result might suggest that Egyptians, most Egyptians, or the plurality of Egyptians, are Asian in origin, not African, and therefore do not belong to the ancient Egyptian branch. What's crazy is if you look at the deeper history, so I've taken us back to AD 600s. That's several thousand years after the flood, or 2,500 years after the flood or so, maybe 3,000, depending on where you put it exactly. If you look at the deeper history of that branch, who do the Arabs come from? Ask that question. They share a common ancestor with most sub-Saharan Africans, Black Africans in common parlance, in the 700s to 400s BC. And again, for sake of time, I'll just summarize a lot of it and say there's multiple independent lines of evidence that suggest that the origin of the Arabs, and therefore the plurality of modern Egyptians, actually have an African origin. Now, there are two significant sons of Ham that relate to Africa. One, of course, is Misraim, Egypt. The other is Cush. The Cushites, often viewed as the Nubians or the Ethiopians, the Sudanese, the ancient dark-skinned peoples. Well, the Sudanese, the Nubians, actually were one of the dynasties of Egypt. I think it's the 25th dynasty. They were the ones that the Assyrians conquered when they invaded Egypt. So at the end of the day, when we're asking, do modern Egyptians come from an ancient Egyptian lineage? Well, is it Cushite? Is it Misraim? You're almost splitting hairs because the ancient Egyptian civilization was ruled by Cushites for a time. I'm actually suspicious that this branch is probably from Cush, not Misraim, but that's something future research will have to uncover. There's some key Northeast African branches that require some further testing. If you're watching this and you're Egyptian, there may be some really interesting research to do. Or if you're Sudanese, there's some Northeast Sudan lineages that give some hints of being connected specifically to Misraim. But that's the type of thing that this book tries to do. And that's one example with Egypt, that there is some connection. But to give sort of the general principle, the biggest surprise for me, surprise in the sense of, what do you expect if you don't have any answer as to the origin and fate of various peoples? As a general rule, the answer to the question, what happened to ancient civilizations, what happened to the people of these ancient civilizations, they become the people of other civilizations. So modern Egyptians tracing back to Arabs who trace back to Nubians who are connected to ancient Egypt, it's all interconnected. And the first several chapters of this book walk through the reasons why mathematically, based on population growth and other reasons why this is entirely consistent, not necessarily intuitive, but entirely consistent with what we know about the history of mankind. But it's pretty shocking once you first see it, like, whoa, everyone is really connected. And this civilization became this other civilization in ways I never would have thought, because you think you hear political history and it's all so cut and dry or disconnected. You never think that this bleeds over into this, and there you have it.
That is awesome, Dr. Jeanson. And while we're on the subject of the history of the human family, I wanted to ask about tracing a person's heritage. In your book, at the end of chapter 4, Faster Than We Think, you write, physical features can change in the generational blink of an eye. Standard genetic tests offer little additional insight. Again, none of these conclusions follows from anything other than basic biology. The principles of genetics that we all learned in school tell us that ethnic changes can happen much quicker than you or I appreciate. Find the ancestors and descendants of ancient civilizations, we're going to have to look for clues somewhere else. So, Dr. Jeanson, it sounds like you're saying that because physical features can change in just a few generations, we'll have to find other ways to trace our heritages. So, Dr. Jeanson, you already kind of got into this a little bit, but how can a listener trace their personal heritage?
Yeah, so I would say with a genetic test, specifically a Y chromosome test, and this isn't necessarily to sell the book, but I'm trying to think of another place I've got these answers published. The last several page color plate in the book, there's 234 of them, very visual book, is a table that says find your Y chromosome branch, and this will tell you which chapter to look up some more details of your history, which son of Noah you come from, maybe even some details about other, I don't know if I got into specific other men in Genesis 10. Like, for example, I can say the branch I belong to, R1b, not necessarily a pretty name, but it's just there's a system to this, heavily in Western Europe, that comes through a son of Joktan. We have that much detail. So Joktan being about the 5th generation down from Shem in Genesis 10, he has several sons, 13 sons, I think. Many of these are never talked about again in Scripture. They're good candidates for giving rise to places not talked about much in Scripture, Central Asia being one of them. And R1b has a Central Asian origin, came into Europe in the Middle Ages. Talk a lot about this, and I think it's chapter 7 in the book, History of Europe. In fact, the majority of Europeans today trace their ancestry back to Central Asia in the fairly recent past, it seems. So using the Y chromosome test and then getting as many of your independent male branches is the way to uncover this detailed personal history for your family.
That is really intriguing, Dr. Jeanson. It shows the awesome discoveries that can be made with genetics. And speaking of which, in the 10th chapter of your book, you used a phrase which I thought was really striking, namely genetic unity. Chapter 10 was called The Far East, The Great Divide. While you also have a section in there called Genetic Diversity, you also had, as I mentioned earlier, a section called Genetic Unity. In this section, you wrote, however, if you've been paying attention to the names of these haplogroups, then you know I've only told half of the genetic story. Haplogroups O1b2, O1b, O1a, and O2 are all subdivisions within haplogroup O, which means that these haplogroups are connected. Dr. Jeanson, can you please explain what haplogroups are, how they are linked to the concept of genetic unity, and how these all fit to the overall point of the book Traced?
Yeah, first some background on the Far East chapter. I had written it fairly detailed initially, fairly detailed in terms of its history, independent of genetics. And a number of the readers I had in initial draft said this is too detailed, too deep. So anyone who's reading and they're from an international location, they'll probably find it has a fairly Western bent to it, but that's by design because many of the Western readers said, we never learned this Chinese history, it's too much. So there's a lot of backstory I have to tell in these chapters and simplification I have to do for the Western reader who's not learned this in school. But with that in mind, one of the specific things I mentioned in the chapter on the Far East is how many of these various cultures and civilizations were connected. You can see this genetically by their branches, let's say in Vietnam, connected to the branches in China. What's interesting is, I think it's either the oral history or traditional history in Vietnam says they came from China. And this is one example of the history that the peoples themselves describe matches very tightly the history that we see in the Y chromosome, which is really interesting. I think the mainstream community, again, has long dismissed native accounts as, well, what do we do with it? They're coming around now and putting a little bit more stock into it and taking it into account as they do archaeological research and not dismissing it entirely as fanciful or far-fetched. But the Y chromosome to me is where this really explodes. And it's not just the Far East. One of the main points of the chapter on South Asia, India, is how interlinked the history of Europe and the history of India are at the genetic level. Time and time again, all throughout their history, AD era, BC era, the same Central Asian peoples are going into Europe and into South Asia, and there are recent common ancestors, distant common ancestors, ancestors all throughout the history of mankind between these very distant geographic locations. The haplogroup term is just scientific shorthand for branch. I use that term over and over again just because that's oftentimes what you'll hear, perhaps even if you get a genetic test. But haplogroup, again, is just scientific shorthand for a branch, a major branch, or a sub-branch on the family tree. And there's a whole scheme for naming it that's ugly to look at, but is very practical and functional, so that you can look at a name and say, okay, I know exactly where I am on the tree. And it's that lingo that I use in that final table in the book, in the final table in the colored plates, to line up someone's genetic test with their history and their biblical history as well.
So, Dr. Jeanson, I really appreciated the points you raised here, and throughout this interview together, you and I have been looking at your new book, Traced. But for this question, we're actually going to be taking a look at the writings of Charles Darwin. And before we do that, I just want to let listeners know that what Darwin said here was very unsettling and evil. And so be prepared for what you're about to hear. And obviously, Dr. Jeanson and Christ Jesus Ministries, we wholeheartedly disagree with what Darwin says. So this is what Charles Darwin wrote. He said, "More civilized, so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish Hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." Professor of history Richard Weinkart, in his book, How Darwinism Influenced Hitler, Nazism, and White Nationalism, wrote that not only racism, but racial extermination was an integral feature of Darwin's theory from the start. So, Dr. Jeanson, what do your discoveries prove or disprove about race and ethnicity? Could your research impact the epidemic of racism in our country?
There are a whole number of ways I think this research impacts the question of racism, races, and such. And I want to step back for a minute and put it in the context of what's been said before about the concept of race. If you've followed genetic discoveries, or really even if you follow the news, you've probably heard something along the lines of, well, there really is no genetic basis for race. And what they're often referring to is comparing the DNA that we inherit from both parents across the various ethnic groups on our planet. And we really are all about 99.9% genetically identical. We're all human. Yes, that's a good point. It's an important point. The point I make in the book, though, is a different one, not a contradictory one, a complementary one. It's unraveling, again, who various peoples came from. And again, one of the big shocks is the peoples of one civilization become the peoples of another. And there's a whole variety of ways to do that. But what's so incredible is how one so-called race becomes another race. The big picture point is this research, and really the family tree for global humanity, this new Rosetta Stone, shows that the so-called races have changed multiple times in human history. Now, this is genetically very easy to do. And in a sense, I think everyone is familiar with this, even if they don't recognize it at first glance. Anyone who's encountered a so-called biracial couple or an interracial marriage, where you've got one ethnicity marrying another ethnicity, let's say you've got a dark-skinned parent and a light-skinned parent, their children are often middle brown. And if you're able to live long enough and see what happens when those children grow up and see who they marry, if one of those children grows up and marries another, let's say, middle brown child, who's also an offspring of a light-skinned and dark-skinned parent, they can have children that are all over the spectrum in terms of skin tone. So you can have a light-skinned parent have a dark-skinned grandchild or great-grandchild, or a dark-skinned parent have a light-skinned great-grandchild. That's really fast. So it's very easy to do, but we don't think in those terms typically. You know, Darwin's terms about Caucasians, just the terms white, black, Caucasian, Asian, African, all these implicitly assume, to a degree, that the so-called races and ethnicities have been stable or unchanging for thousands of years. What the Y chromosome-based tree, this new Rosetta Stone, shows is that's not true. So again, for example, most Europeans trace their male ancestry back to Central Asia. So people like me and you likely came from olive-skinned East Asian-looking peoples just 1,000 years ago. There are dark-skinned Africans, some in Zambia, low percentage, but there are some dark-skinned Africans, Zambia, Cameroon, who belong to the same branch as I do. So they came from olive-skinned ancestors who, again, I think this is connected to the invasion of the Huns and some of the other invaders from the East who established a kingdom in North Africa. And then those lineages and peoples eventually spilled down into sub-Saharan Africa. There are dark-skinned African peoples who have olive-skinned ancestors and are related to people like me. One of the examples I just gave with the history of ancient Egypt, who do most modern Egyptians come from? Or I should say, who do the plurality of modern Egyptians come from? From Arabs, who are connected to dark-skinned Nubia, Sudan. Well, let me add one more step to this story. The branch to which 40% of modern Egyptians belong can also be found in Scandinavia. So you have pale-faced, light-skinned Scandinavians who came from olive-skinned Arab ancestors, who came from dark-skinned Sudanese, and the Sudanese are some of the darkest-skinned people in the world, who are connected to ancient Egypt. The history of humanity is very messy in terms of racial and ethnic categories. There are Europeans who are connected to East Asia, even to Chinese through this tree in the recent past. There are light-skinned Europeans and dark-skinned South Asians, Indians, who had a recent common ancestor. There's just so many examples of this all throughout the tree. It makes these terms, white, black, Asian, African, so forth, almost null and void. Now, if you want to advance a racist argument where one so-called race is greater than another, how can you do that if the races are fluid and changing? How can you, and really, let's say, what do we have in the United States? That it's light-skinned, there are racist, white supremacists, light-skinned is superior. Well, many of those people likely had either olive-skinned ancestors, dark-skinned ancestors. There's all sorts of complicated ancestries and histories that have given rise to modern peoples. It makes the attempt to come up with a racist justification all the more irrational. I mean, it's not rational in the first place, but once you add in this history, it becomes even crazier. And my hope is transformative when people realize, oh, my own history is messy. Oh, what I thought was a category of people like white or black or brown or whatever it is, really is meaningless in terms of what's actually happened in the history of peoples on our planet. And hopefully this will produce then a much better sense of the unity among the human race, and that differences can arise quickly and then disappear quickly, and that what we think we are is likely very different from who we actually come from.
Dr. Jeanson, thank you so much for taking the time to address that subject. Indeed, like you said, all the racist or white supremacist beliefs, including those held by Darwin, are actually evil and foolish in light of all this research. And for these last two questions now, we're going to continue to look at Darwin's views as opposed to creation science. In the 6th chapter of your book, Traced, you wrote, well, Y chromosome DNA should have become riddled with errors if humans have been in existence for hundreds of thousands of years. How does our DNA look? Does our Y chromosome bear the signature of hundreds of thousands of years of human existence? Or do they tell a different story? So, Dr. Jeanson, in light of this quote, how does your research impact the veracity of the young Earth position?
To me, this research is one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. And this I would justify on several counts. Number one, we already have prior evidence from the female inherited DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, scientific evidence that points towards a recent origin of humanity. That's measuring the parent offspring rate at which DNA changes. It's really a math argument. We've all learned the distance equals rate times time. In this case, it's genetic differences equal the rate at which these differences arise plus time. And so we know the number of genetic differences because we have DNA from people around the globe. How long does it take? How fast can we dial those differences back to zero, which would be the beginning, which would be Adam and Eve? And we already had DNA before traced and actually I cover this in Replacing Darwin, for the recent origin, maternally, of the human race. This now adds, again, measuring father-son, the rate at which fathers copy their DNA in error and pass it on to their sons. This adds now the male inheritance. And again, so we can see that actual rate, the measured rate, fits the young Earth timescale. So two independent lines of evidence pointing towards the same conclusion, the recent origin. But perhaps the biggest bombshell comes from a prediction made in Replacing Darwin. And the principle behind it, it's not something unique or special to me. Anyone can derive this from scripture. So let's contrast for a moment the anthropologies and timescales of evolution versus creation. And then we'll think about how that relates to genetics. The evolutionary timescale says anatomically modern humans arose hundreds of thousands of years ago. So if you're talking about human history, you've got this very long timescale. And at the very tail end of it, they would say the last 5,000 years is the history of civilization, Egypt and Sumer and Assyria and Babylon and all the rest. The young Earth timescale says there's the pre-flood world, which is destroyed in the flood, and then there's the post-flood world, and the post-flood world is the history of civilization. The history of civilization is post-flood history. They're basically synonymous. The evolutionary timescale says the history of civilization is just this tiny tip at the tail end of this extremely long process. Now, bring in genetics. What we're looking for primarily when we're looking for the echo of civilization is population dispersal. So like I said, some of the backstory to this research is we're looking for the echo of the transatlantic slave trade. We have historical records saying this is when slaves, ugly history, this is when slaves were physically forced onto ships and moved away from Africa, never to return again. And there are also, of course, people who stayed in Africa. So we should be able to see on the family tree a point at which the branches split, go their separate ways. Or you might see, again, the example of the Mongols. You've got East Asian DNA coming into Europe. In a sense, that's both a mixing on the European end and a separation on the Central Asian, East Asian end. Because there's a point at which some of those men bring branches into Europe, and those Europeans likely don't go back to Central Asia, maybe until later. Russians conquer later in history. Those are the types we're looking to see. So the dates we assign to the branches are the critical element of this analysis. In the young Earth timescale, we should be able to assign dates. And as we assign dates, say, aha, we can see this event, this event, this event. Then boom, it just starts popping out of the tree, and it should be very recognizable. The evolutionary timescale says, well, we should be able to assign dates, and only to the very tail end, the tip, that we should be able to see something going on. And in fact, the last 5,000 years, if we bring in the technical side of this sort of genetic analyses, is where you get a lot of statistical noise. From an evolutionary perspective, it's almost not even worth looking for the echo of civilization because there's no guarantee you'll find it and be able to separate it from the statistical noise. So this is a very stark contrast. It should be, so from the young Earth perspective, there should be event after event after event after event all over our DNA that we know from history. The evolutionary timescale says almost all of our DNA has no record of this because it's just the very tail end where you see Egypt and Rome and Greece and Persia and all these other things. So that's the point of the book. We do see all over our DNA the echoes of known human history, migration, separations, and there's another technical point about population growth, which I bring out and explain in the book. But we should be able to see that all over our DNA. We do, and that makes for a very strong case. It's not just the tips of the branches, which is really what father-son mutation rates, copying error rates measure. It's all throughout this tree, boom, 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 boom. All these events line up as they should, given this time scale. And again, it all comes down to what dates do you assign and the dates that reveal for us the history, and it should line up with what we already know from historical records and archaeology, and that's exactly what we see.
We've actually now arrived at our final question. At the end of the day, I'm sure that you and I would both agree that the most important part of any research that we do is that research brings glory to Christ Jesus, the creator of humanity, the earth, our solar system, the whole universe. Kepler, a devout Lutheran and biblical creationist, said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. And so in conclusion, how does your book, Traced, uphold biblical authority and point readers back to Jesus?
I'll derive an answer from an apologetic framework that I use. Really, the question is, what's my purpose? What should be my purpose biblically as an apologist? And I go to Romans 1 for the answer. Romans 1 tells us that everyone knows God exists. Richard Dawkins famous atheist, knows that God exists. The things of God are clearly seen, revealed in nature, revealed in ourselves, but people suppress the truth. They shut it down. One of the long-standing members of AIG recently passed, Dave Menton, told a story about how when he was at the University of St. Louis, taught anatomy and physiology to medical students for 33 years. He had, of course, a number of unbelieving colleagues, and he would ask them if there were ever times they would maybe lay awake at night and doubt their unbelief, their refusal to be a Christian. And he said all of them would say no. He said very different when he'd ask Christians, because many of them would go through times of doubt, waxing and waning. I think all this fits what the Bible says about faith and theology and such, and the process of the fact of salvation, how it works. And there's a lot there that to me leads me to expect, yes, Christians go up. You see biblical figures going up and down. David's own life, we're running off the Philistines, and there's waxing and waning. But the unbelievers you all talked to said, no, we never doubt. And that to me is consistent with there's an active choice of no, we're going to shut down this evidence that we see. So what then is the role of the Christian, the apologist, when encountering believers who know God exists? Well, there's no need to prove that God exists. To me, the job is to remove those excuses and say, no, sorry, that means of suppressing the truth doesn't work anymore. Let's get back to the real issue. And so one of the main excuses, of course, in the Western world for rejecting Scripture, whether it's either rejecting Scripture entirely or trying to somehow change Scripture to fit the latest scientific ideas, is this idea of evolution in millions of years. And one of the main ways they say no other idea is allowed, evolution has a monopoly on this, is by saying creation science isn't science. To the extent that even 6,000 years is almost a swear word. It's laughable, and don't say that. That's forbidden. We don't talk about that thing here. This book removes that excuse. It shows testable predictions. It puts biblical authority on offense. It says, sorry, no, this is actually a superior scientific explanation for who we came from. Better than evolution. It meets the long-standing challenges to creation science. It exceeds those standards. Those excuses don't work anymore. Now let's get back to the main issue, which is the gospel. And that's what the book ends with. So the book is written for believers and unbelievers alike. I assume that the reader doesn't know anything about the Scripture. I mean, it's great if they do, but I take the approach, I'm not going to just assume if I reference a verse, you know what I'm talking about, or assume some sort of knowledge. I wanted the book to be useful to Christians and to be able to use useful to non-Christians. Let's say you want to give the book away to someone who's an unbeliever. This book will challenge your ideas. That's how I wrote it. Hopefully, I intended it to be accessible. Really, the book talks about family trees and dates and a little bit of genetics background, but it doesn't get to the level of genetic depth that Replacing Darwin does. So, and part of the design of that is to try to reach as wide an audience as possible. Some of the technical details get shoved into the appendix, and there's supplemental material online for the technical person who wants that level of justification. And then, of course, like I said, the book ends with the gospel, puts it in historical context, in sort of the theme of the overall book being history, goes and starts that chapter on the gospel starts with history biblically, Adam and Eve and God's perfect world and how it's been corrupted and cursed by God. And cursed by God and corrupted by mankind and our sin, and how we need a savior. So that's how the book points to it. There's ways it removes the excuses unbelievers give for denying the truth about God, and it gives them the gospel at the end of it.
Dr. Jeanson, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Jeanson's biographical information on the Answers in Genesis website, his technical papers and books, including his new book Trace in the description below, along with the material Dr. Jeanson mentioned in the interview. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.